Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. And it's that time of year again when most of the listeners are facing their A-level exams, or if you're studying overseas, whatever qualification it is that is the equivalent. But it's a testing time for a great many people, and so I thought I'd do my annual speech from the Jeep, so to speak. Really about what kind of challenges, if you've got an exam tomorrow, you're going to be facing, what the mindset is to go into the exam hall with. Okay, so the first thing to remember if you are facing an exam tomorrow is that the examiner isn't looking to catch you out. The examiner is not some horrendous individual that's looking to find ways to fail you. The examiner is really almost constitutionally pre-programmed through their work to find where you've got it right. Okay, so they are looking to find ways to reward you. So that's a positive. And it's a positive because if you understand what it is the examiner wishes to reward you for, then the trick is to give them what they want. Now, you're not a teller of history. You're an explainer, you're an arguer, you're a debater, you are a discusser of history. And this is the kind of quantum leap forward that will distinguish you from other less successful candidates. I hate to say it, but there are going to be people who will walk into the exam tomorrow with their heads crammed full of knowledge. They've done tons and tons and tons of revision, and they will still walk away with D's and E grades because they'll do completely the wrong thing. If there's a question about to what extent was Hitler's government one that ruled through terror, to what extent did it rule through consent? If there's a question about how far can economic policy in the Soviet Union in the 1930s be said to have been a success? If there's a question on to what extent was Ireland the biggest problem for the Liberal government on the eve of the First World War? In each of those instances, you're being asked to make a judgment, and the judgment is the basis of the essay. It is the most important factor. If you go in and tell the story, if you answer a question, to what extent was Ireland the biggest problem for the Liberal Party on the eve of the First World War, and you, with a long, deep breath, say, in 1906 the Liberal Party came to power, and they did some social reform, and they faced opposition from the Conservatives, from the Lords, and then in 1910 some Labour MPs got elected, and there was something to do with the suffragettes, and then they had lots of problems with trade unions, and so on and so forth. And then finally you start talking about Ireland, and you say, and there were problems in Ireland, and the Third Home Rule Act, and so on and so forth. You've lost any structure, any coherence to your answer long before you've been able to even address it. You've started off with this long, meaningless narrative. And think about your own life. There's no way that if somebody asked you a judgment-based question that you'd bombard them with narrative. To what extent did you enjoy the last Marvel superheroes film? Well, then, you're going to say, well, to a greater extent, I thought it was well made. I thought it had a good cast. I thought it had a good script. I thought it was directed well. And you would not launch into some endless, meaningless diatribe about the plotline of Spider-Man and the Hulk, etc., etc. Similarly, what I've just done there, I've given a judgment and then supported it by evidence why I think these things. To go back to the Marvel superheroes example, I thought it was good because it has a good director, because it has a good script. To what extent was Ireland the biggest problem facing Britain or the Liberal government on the eve of the First World War? Of the problems that the Liberal government faced, it appears to be the biggest one because there is very much the likelihood of civil war in 1914, because officers at the Curragh mutiny over the imposition of Home Rule. So make your judgment and justify it by evidence. And this is the way to create a sound and strong essay. It's all about creating a clear judgment, and this obviously comes from your revision. The judgments you have are based on how well you actually know a subject. If you don't know anything about the Liberal government, you're not going to be able to make any sorts of opinions on it. Your judgments come from how well you know a thing, and it's about being able to select evidence that supports the judgment that you've come out with. So our first principle is you are not a teller of history. You're not there to bombard the examiner with narrative, because you're simply not addressing the question. You're just saying things, and that doesn't make any sense. It becomes some sort of a meaningless diatribe. Second point is that once you have your line of argument, that line of argument needs to be supported by evidence. You need to have evidence, facts, perhaps even historiographical argument from other historians to support what it is you're actually trying to say. The way to begin an essay of this nature is to start with a clear line of argument in the introduction. As some of you may know, there's various versions of this on my website. If you go to explaininghistory.com/free stuff and scroll down to the bottom, there's a bit called miscellaneous odds and ends, and there's all sorts of essay exemplars in there. I always start with a kind of a sandwich introduction, which starts with a preamble. It starts with a contextualizing sentence. You're being asked about the Liberal government. So you might want to say, between 1906 and 1914, a Liberal government ruled Britain that faced a series of challenges. Despite starting off with a huge minority, it was a government in serious problems by 1914. That's fine. So noticeably, in that little preamble sentence, I haven't addressed the question. I've said something that's largely non-controversial. And this is important. All it's meant to do is to give the reader a starting place, a piece of context to springboard from. From there, you go into the line of argument. And you say, however, by 1914, the problems that the government had faced, be they with female suffrage, the trade unions, the Lords, and Ireland, of those, Ireland is the most significant and the most serious of those problems. Now, obviously, only say that if you actually think that Ireland was the most significant of those problems. It's arguable that it wasn't. So once you've expressed your line of argument, you've said, essentially, of the various directions I could go in this essay, I'm cutting all the others off and I'm going down this particular route for very good reason, because the evidence supports this particular journey. Now, this acts as a discipline on you, the writer. This prevents you from sort of meandering off into other arguments that will contradict you. It's not to say that you shouldn't explore the other possibilities. Of course you should. You need to look at suffrage, say, for example, and say, well, it was to some extent a problem, however, not the most significant one facing Great Britain on the eve of the First World War. You need to examine in each paragraph the different particular factors and then explain why you eliminate them one by one. Once you've done your line of argument, the third part of the introduction is out, and you can dispense with this if you haven't got time, but it's always a good one to give yourself some structure. It's a kind of a methodological statement, and it really says, within this essay, this essay will explore the following key themes. For this, it would be the Lords, Ireland, the suffrage movement, and the trade unions. And as you go through, you can say, look at, for example, the question of the Lords and say, this was a big challenge for the Liberal government, but it wasn't for the biggest problem they faced. And you can balance your essay by saying, these are not insignificant problems. They are not immaterial. They are not things that we can just simply discount and ignore. They do have to be considered, and they were serious issues. But the reason why Ireland is the bigger issue for the Liberal government is X, Y, Z. It is because it threatens civil war. And you can perhaps even look at what happens in 1916 during the Easter Rising to demonstrate that the threat of civil war really isn't an unrealistic one, because it essentially does happen during the First World War. The paragraphs that you create, a simple, effective way to talk about them is to make 3 or 4 points per paragraph. And each point should be supported by evidence and come to a clear judgment. So let's say, for example, we want to do a paragraph about the women's suffrage movement. We want to start off by saying, yes, it is significant, transition onto the idea that it did cause serious headaches for the Liberal government, but then finally conclude that these problems are not as serious as the threat posed by Ireland. So the first part of that, a point evidence judgment, might be that by 1913 the situation has become so serious with law and disorder from the suffrage movement that the Cat and Mouse Act has to be instituted. What does this tell us? It tells us that there are a significant number of suffragettes in prison, that they are going on hunger strike, that they are risking their lives in order to protest against the lack of a vote. And you might also want to mention things such as the year before Emily Wilding Davidson's death at the Derby, and these kinds of events. Now you can say so you can say, yes, your point is, yes, this is a serious problem. Your evidence is the Cat and Mouse Act, Emily Wilding Davidson, that kind of thing. And the judgment is that the judgment is really, what does this all show us? It shows us that largely unprecedented events were taking place in Great Britain on the eve of the war. Now, later on in that paragraph, you can balance that out by going, yes, these things are serious, they are extreme. However, they are largely containable. Why? Because the British establishment, the government, the judiciary, the press, what you would refer to as the patriarchy, it shows a largely united front, and public opinion is not always, very rarely in fact, in the suffragettes' favour, and that when the war happens, the WSPU very quickly falls in behind the government and believes that a path of respectability and obedience is required. And the strategy in 1914, contrary to popular opinion, was not necessarily to get behind the war effort in the anticipation that women would be rewarded after the war. It was simply that the Pankhursts and their supporters believed that whatever the failings of British democracy, it was infinitely preferable to domination by the German Kaiser over Europe, and that some sort of war for civilization was being fought, and this must be supported, even if it meant supporting a regime that had been previously unpopular with the suffragettes. Anyway, that is by the by. So the a paragraph can contain these slightly conflicting elements to it. You can have your point, your evidence, your judgment, and then also kind of like a balancing point that says, before we go down the route of suggesting that the suffragettes were this overwhelming problem to the Liberal government, we still have to remember that the Liberal government managed to contain female suffrage very successfully, and female suffrage itself kind of ceases to be a fundamental problem in 1914, whereas Irish nationalism doesn't go away, and Irish nationalism by 1916 is a revolutionary force. So what are you doing there? You are evaluating your factors, you are looking at them and comparing them and casting a critical eye over them and really getting to that point of critical thinking. And it's the critical thinking that the examiner really wants to see from you. It is that argumentative side to you, that ability to debate, to take a position on something and defend it. Not simply just to trot out things that have been, trot out things in a textbook in verbatim fashion. They want to see argument and critical thinking. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why? Why is this so important? I thought that simply the study of history is about knowing about facts and dates. And it's not really. Anyone can do that. That's not studying history. That's, going on Wikipedia. Studying history is important for developing critical thinking and arguing and debating, because really this is everything you do outside of school, in college and university, or out in the working world, that you're evaluating information, looking at knowledge, looking at information and assessing it and looking for meaning within it and challenging what that meaning is. Think of everything you would do if you were in the legal profession, everything you would do if you were in the media, if you were a journalist. Think of everything you would do if you were handling large sums of money in investment or banking. You need to look at data. You need to look at, well, what is this telling me? Is this telling me that the client I'm representing is guilty or innocent? Is this telling me that the investment I'm making is a sound one or a foolish one based on the market data I have in front of me? Is this telling me that the story I'm about to break will stand up or fall? Being able to sift through knowledge and critically evaluate it and look at what it means and what it suggests and what it implies and what it shows, that is the art of history. And that is why this is a valuable and important subject, because it is the subject of critical thinking. So again, what your job is tomorrow when you go into the exam, or when you next go into the exam, is you are a critical thinker, an inquirer, an arguer, and a debater of history. You're not simply there to repeat historians' opinions. You're there, if you need to take issue with those opinions, to question them, to challenge them, to argue against them, to point out where they don't work, to show where they do work. You're there, if you're doing source-based questions, to look at them and say, well, there are shortcomings to this source. One of them is that we don't know enough about it. We don't know exactly who wrote it. We don't know quite when it was written. It could have all sorts of different meanings. Some students go into an exam and if it's a source-based question, they look at the sources and they unconsciously think that their job is to say why the source is a good one. But the more you point out the problems with the source, the more you question the problems with the ability of the source to do anything at all, well, there are marks in there. There are marks in there because it shows that you are evaluating and thinking critically. Anyway, I think this point has been made, and I wish you guys all luck. Please, if anybody has any particular exciting results, a great question you've done, something you want to share, or if this has been useful to you, please email me, info@explaininghistory.com. Now, I am going to be appearing in November in Cambridge alongside Sir Richard Dearlove and Robert Service again, and I'm just going to grab you the dates. It's Monday, the 14th of November, 2016, so if you or your school or college wants to come and meet me, have a conversation about Russian history, you can check me out at www.aimconferences, that's AIM, conferences.co.uk, and it was a great event last year, really, really interesting, some great talks from Robert Service, Richard Dearlove and myself, and it'd be great to see you guys, so come and check it out, and I'll hopefully see you then. Anyway, good luck and Godspeed, and I'll see you on the next Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye.